Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBIA webinar on essential skills for supervisors and managers. I'm your host, Diane Mokriski, HR and Employment Law Counsel here at CBIA. Today's webinar is really meant to be an acknowledgement of the enormity of a supervisor's job. They have to keep the business running, manage and communicate with individuals and teams of employees, and then also somehow keep up with all the latest employment laws. We provide this particular seminar at CBIA every year, focusing on different skills each time. So today we'll concentrate on three key areas in the employment context that are really crucial for managers and supervisors to master. The first topic of the morning will focus on mistakes, the most costly mistakes that managers commonly make. So here we won't be talking about production errors, but instead HR-related mistakes that very often end up costing the company thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in litigation costs. This is because the company will often be monetarily responsible for the HR mistakes made by their supervisory employees. The second segment will focus on an issue that has become more and more important initially as a result of the pandemic, and that is how best to manage a hybrid workforce. And I say initially as a result of the pandemic because even as COVID numbers improve in Connecticut and elsewhere, many companies are discovering that a hybrid workforce may actually far outlast the pandemic. And so this raises unique and challenging managerial issues, and so we'll talk through those. And then finally, we'll delve into the issue of drug and alcohol misuse within your workforce and how best to recognize and respond to potential problems that your employees are having. This is an issue we've covered before in earlier seminars, and we've decided to address it again because in the last year, this has actually been one of the most frequent issues that our members have raised and have sought help for. We'll hear from experts in each of these fields, with each segment running for about an hour, with time for questions from all of you at the end of each segment. If you do think of a question, you can submit it through the Q&A. We'll just use the chat function for discussions amongst yourselves. I won't be answering questions from the chat. So we'll get to as many questions as we can toward the end of each segment. We'll take a 15-minute break between each topic, and then we'll plan to conclude at about 11:45. So let's get started with our first segment, focusing on managerial mistakes. And for that, we'll hear from two attorneys from the law firm of Murtha Cullina. So we've got Sal Gangemi, who's a partner in the litigation department of Murtha Cullina and who's a member of the Labor and Employment Practice Group. Sal advises clients with respect to state, federal, and local employment laws, handling matters in federal and state courts and before administrative agencies like the EEOC, the Labor Department, and the Connecticut and New York Commissions on Human Rights. He counsels clients on day-to-day issues involving workplace management and administration, including requests for reasonable accommodations, for family and medical leave, and wage and hour issues. He also conducts employment law training on a variety of topics like sexual harassment prevention and wage and hour compliance. And with Sal, we've got Patricia Riley, who chairs the firm's Labor and Employment Practice Group and also co-chairs the firm's Education Group. She also litigates employment matters in state and federal courts and administrative agencies. And Tricia advises clients on employment law matters like sexual harassment and discrimination avoidance, disability and pregnancy accommodation, FMLA, wage and hour compliance, and trade secrets and restrictive covenants. And last year, the publication Best Lawyers in America recognized her as Lawyer of the Year for New Haven in both labor and employment litigation and management side employment law. So despite all of those accomplishments and all of those accolades for both Sal and Tricia, they still simply could not follow the rules and come up with 10 managerial mistakes. As it says in our program, they insist that there are actually 13. So let's see, Sal and Tricia, I'll throw it over to you, and why don't you tell us what the top 13 managerial mistakes are?
Thank you, Diane, for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tricia Riley, and with me is Sal Gangemi. 13 because lucky 13. I don't know, it's around Halloween. We thought it went well with our theme, which is we're close to Halloween. So therefore, we're usually very bright and cheery, but since it's close to Halloween, we thought it was a good time for a good scare. Sal, I'm not seeing the slides on my screen.
Nor am I.
Sal, you have to go ahead and press share your screen at the bottom.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Sorry about that. Hang on. Apologize. This is not part of the Halloween routine, but let's see.
Might as well be.
No, I know, right? It's like, the only one scared right now is me. Give me a sec. Okay.
The House of Horrors.
All right. Do you see it now?
There we go. Yes.
Sorry about that,
Go
folks.
back to the first one where we have our cute little emojis.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. There we go. Okay. All right.
All right. So here we are, close to Halloween. Time for a good scare. Okay,
Right.
Well.
All right. So here, we'll start on this one, Tricia.
Yes.
Okay.
So as I was saying, usually we're positive and upbeat, but today we're going to present the top 13 manager and supervisor mistakes we've seen in our combined 60 years of practice. So we did move it to 13 because we added a couple and thought it was a good number. So the general categories that these fall into tend to be wage and hour issues, which result in very, very large class action settlements or damages awards. And I'm going to be going through all of the wage and hour issues that I've seen that result in the most damages and settlements. And they're common mistakes that the Connecticut Department of Labor and the US Department of Labor will flag. And so I've seen people make these inadvertently, but this is why we're here today to flag these for you so that you are aware of them. Sal is going to handle performance issue, documentation, interpersonal relationship issues, sexual harassment prevention, and the things that fall into those categories. So let's just go over the general, going back to the wage and hour issues that I'm going to hit. A big one is off the clock work. Another one, which is related to off the clock work, is failure to pay or record overtime. Another very, very common error I've seen is not providing a meal break to an employee, and we'll talk about that. Another, again, very common error, and a lot of these they're not done out of malice, they're just done out of convenience and not knowing that this is something that the Department of Labor will flag. Correcting or changing an employee's timesheets without the employee acknowledging or signing off. And then the final category, which may or may not be applicable to you depending on your job, is misclassification of employees as exempt or non-exempt. Often HR will classify the employees as exempt or non-exempt, but sometimes management has a role in that as well. And so I'll hit that issue too. So let's start with the next one, Sal. Thank you. Off the clock work. Okay, so what's the definition of off the clock work? It's allowing or requiring employees to work before clocking in or after clocking out. Now, I want to focus on the word allowing. We all know as managers that if we say to our employees, you have to work an hour extra after work, and they're non-exempt hourly wage employees, or non-exempt salary employees, either way, you have to pay them overtime. So the mistakes usually happen. And of course, if you intentionally tell them to work overtime and don't pay them, you could also possibly be subject to punitive damages. But let's assume that this is inadvertent on your part, in that, a certain employee is, depending on the job, staying late in the office a little bit, seems to be clocking out and then going into the office. Or a really big one for white collar hourly workers is going to their office or going to their cubicle, logging onto their computer, but not logging into the timekeeping system. And so they're working, but they're not keeping track of their hours. If you know this is happening, then you are designated to be the employer for purposes of this regulation and statute, and you're allowing the employee to work. So the regulation, the statute says that if the employer permits the employee to work, that is going to result, and doesn't pay them overtime, that's going to result, doesn't pay them for off the clock work or any work, then that is going to result in a penalty. So let me rephrase that. Permitting or allowing the employee to work off the clock, in other words, work before they clock in or continue to work after they've clocked out, whether that's on a factory floor or in a white collar setting, a cubicle, a computer, that employee has to be paid for that time that they are working. So a lot of offices or manufacturing facilities, they may have allow employees to come in, have a cup of coffee before they start their shift. Okay, just make sure they're not working, because I've had this in hospital settings where it may occur and it's unclear. There's not a bright line between work and socializing. Let's just say if somebody shows up at the station, early and is drinking a cup of coffee, well, if they get a patient emergency, they're going to be working. Or if they're talking about work or going over paperwork is a very common thing. Well, I'm not actually working yet. I'm getting caught up on what I did yesterday because I didn't log such and such a thing. That's work. Okay, so we have to really be aware of what our employees are doing. Okay, and so what do you do if they're working off the clock? You tell them they must clock in and they cannot work off the clock like this. And so then you can performance manage them, and Sal will handle that piece of it later. So one thing that actually happens when you allow employees to work off the clock is that it usually results in them accumulating overtime. If you have a 40-hour-a-week employee who's working extra hours, but before they clock in or after they clock out, they're now in an overtime situation. So when the Department of Labor flags the off-the-clock work, they also attribute that extra time, if it's over 40 hours in a work week, to overtime. So now you're getting hit not just with damages for the actual wages, but damages for the wages at time and a half. And then, of course, there are penalties and interest that would be accumulated as well. And then what happens is the big money on these settlements comes when, not just from the Department of Labor, either on the state or federal level, but attorneys, class action attorneys, love to troll for these kinds of cases. And they look for big organizations where they happen to know, because they have one employee who's been doing this or one employee who reports a violation. And then they troll for other employees and they file class actions, and then they get multi-million-dollar settlements or damages awards. These can result in very large hits to the corporation. And even if it's only one or two individuals and you're just getting audited by the Connecticut Department of Labor, which is common, or the US Department of Labor, which does happen as well, those administrative agencies will also hit you with penalties, back wages, overtime, et cetera. So as I said, off the clock work usually triggers overtime. Separate overtime violations will result in substantial damages, settlements. You cannot, here's another common mistake. You cannot have an hourly employee take comp time or make up the difference for the extra time worked in a different pay period. But if it's the same pay period and they don't hit over 40 hours, okay. But that's different from saying to somebody, you're working 50 hours this pay period, but you only have to work 30 hours next pay period. the point is they have to record their hours. None of this can be off the clock. All of it has to be shown in the wage records. If you know an employee is working off the clock or overtime, you have to pay him or her. Now, you can't say, I didn't authorize that time, so I'm not paying you, all right? What you have to do is handle it with performance management. And the best practice is for your organization to have a policy that says you can't work overtime without prior written approval. Again, it depends on your workforce and how you manage it and what you need, but I find it useful for employers and particularly for managers and supervisors to be able to point to a policy that says, look, you violated the policy by working overtime. I saw you here, for an hour after you already clocked off your shift. And so we have to pay you for that time, but you have to know this is a written warning because you violated the policy. You didn't ask permission and therefore I'm going to it's a performance management issue rather than deducting from wages or not paying them, because that is going to get you in trouble. Okay, so meal breaks. Meal break is another common area where, I always like to say no good deed goes unpunished. So, an employee may say, oh, no, I'm going to eat at my desk today. I prefer to eat at my desk. Look, if they're not working, maybe it's okay in your environment, but it's a common mistake where a manager will allow a person to work at their desk and the person's or to eat at their desk, but the person's working. So the law in Connecticut, which is what we're focused on today, and many other states have a similar law, require an employee to be provided with a meal break, unpaid, but where they're not working at all. So in a 7.5-hour workday, they are entitled to a half an hour unpaid meal period after the first 2 hours and before the last 2 hours of the shift. So that's the timing of it. Okay, so what if an employer pays people to eat, pays you through your meal break? That's okay if they get paid for it, but you have to be really clear. And here's the important thing. In Connecticut, they must clock out for their meal break and clock back in after their meal break is over. And when the Connecticut Department of Labor comes in and looks at your timesheets, they look for the meal break out and the meal break in. They look for that half an hour break. If they don't see the half an hour break, they will expect the person to be paid for that time. So that's a really important fact. And as a manager, you do have to manage that situation with regard to meal breaks. Best practice, and the Department of Labor will look for this because it's a violation if this doesn't happen. Clock out, clock back in, clock out, clock back in. Now, what about automatic clock out, clock in? Some organizations have timekeeping programs that automatically put the meal break in there. That is dangerous, and there have been nationwide class actions that have addressed that because the employee will say, it was automatic, I had no way to change it, and I didn't take my meal break on any of those days. I worked through lunch every one of those days. And when that happens, that there are, as I said, damages will be, found, because that is a violation of definitely in Connecticut and nationally. If a person says, I didn't take my meal break, that it was automatically put in there, they have found damages nationwide for that kind of conduct as well. Okay. Now here's another very common mistake, because it seems natural that you should be able to do this. If you as a manager, supervisor, know that somebody did not work the hours that they put on their timesheet, and so you just want to correct it, even if you're correcting it in their favor, you can only do that if you have the employee initial the change. Ideally, you go to the employee and you say, look, we found this error on the timesheet. You agree with us, it's wrong. Yep, please correct it here and initial it. If that's not feasible, then you have to find a way where if somebody else is correcting it or you're correcting it, you then get the person's sign off, whether that's an initialing the actual timesheet itself, or I've had employers say, well, our system doesn't work that way, it's impossible, but we have to change it. I say, well, then you better get the employee to send an email saying, I authorize, that you're changing my timesheet by half an hour, be specific, and then keep that record of the employee's approval somewhere with the corrected timesheet, because when the Department of Labor comes in and audits you, they are going to want to see that the employee signed off on it. And then the employee can't say that the employer changed it without my knowledge or permission. Okay. All right. Now, Sal and I have given, hour-long seminars on misclassification. So this is a very brief overview of it. And I know many managers here are not actually doing the classification of the job category. They're just accepting whatever HR says it is. But this is an overview just so you can either, if you are doing classification or you are helping HR or management to describe a position, this is just an overview. So basically, for purposes of overtime pay, there are two kinds of categories. And a lot of people get these mixed up in their mind just because they sound so the same and it's kind of hard to figure out. But the two categories are exempt or non-exempt. And the way to think about it is exempt means basically exempt from being paid overtime. Non-exempt means you're not exempt from being paid overtime. And since it's almost like a double negative, what it means is non-exempt employees are entitled to receive overtime. So, many of you, probably most of you, are managing non-exempt employees who are paid hourly or who are paid, on a salary basis, but they get overtime on top of their salary. The most common way to pay non-exempt employees is hourly, because it's just easy to calculate. And then we know if they're being paid hourly, they are also entitled to be paid overtime for any hours worked over 40 in a given work week. Okay, so that's really kind of the way that works. And most employees are going to be categorized as non-exempt. In fact, all employees could technically be categorized as non-exempt. So you could pay all your employees overtime. You could pay the president of the company as a non-exempt hourly employee, and that person could get time and a half for all hours worked over 40 hours. But that would run into a lot of expense normally, because the idea is that people who are exempt can work or are working more than 40 hours a week because of the nature of their job. But the idea is that they're getting paid a sufficient amount of salary so that they don't need to get paid overtime. That's sort of the policy reason behind it. And a few years ago, the minimum weekly salary was raised to $684 per week to be an exempt person. That's still not, six figures. So the very basic level, the very basic minimum to be able to be an exempt employee is that the person has to be paid a minimum of $684 per week. And they do have to be paid on a salary basis, meaning they can't be paid hourly. They have to be paid the same salary every week. They could also get a bonus or something on top of that, but the minimum, and again, the Department of Labor will look for this when they come in. They want to see pay records that show 684. The higher the amount that they're being paid, the easier it is to make the case for an exempt position. But they must also, in addition to the salary basis test, they must meet the duties test to be an exempt employee. So you could pay somebody who is clearly a non-exempt employee, let's say a secretary, an assistant who is doing clerical work. Let's say that person is getting paid $684 per week. They're still not going to be an exempt employee because they're not going to meet the duties test. What are the duties tests? There's three: administrative, professional, and executive. Professional and executive are the easiest to explain. Professional is doctor, lawyer, accountant, someone who has studied in Connecticut. It has to be a minimum of a 4-year degree program to learn the profession in which they are working. So let's say accountant, 4 years of undergraduate in that field, and they're getting paid the minimum salary of $684 per week. That person would be considered a professional exempt, and they might work 70 hours during tax season, but they're still not entitled to overtime. Executive, another easy one to explain. They have to be in charge of a department, and they have to supervise at least 2 full-time equivalent employees, meaning it could be 4 part-time, but it's got to be at least 2 full-time equivalent. And, it's the head of an actual department or recognized subdivision. Administrative exempt is the hardest because it's a bit of a catch-all that some employers like to use to classify employees as exempt when really they're not exempt, because an administrative employee has to be working at a high level in the organization, in that they are able to exercise judgment and discretion on matters of significance to the organization. And so that of matters of significance is really important, meaning you might have an administrative assistant who you think is exercising a lot of judgment and discretion because, she can book your flights, or she can do this, that, or the other thing for you. But those are things, personal to your position or helpful and supportive of your position, but they're really not of significance to the organization. On the other hand, if you have someone who is an HR professional, that person might be categorized as a professional, but also they might be administrative exempt because they're supporting the underlying purpose of the organization, and they're not doing the actual work of the organization, but they are they're part of the administration of the organization. Okay, and so they do not need to be paid overtime. Right. So a common mistake that managers do make is that you may have employees classified as non-exempt or exempt that you're managing, and some managers may give non-exempt work to the exempt employees. So in other words, if you have somebody who actually should be classified as exempt, but you're having them do duties that are really more like non-exempt duties, and an example of this might be the manager of a store. So let's say that you have, a retail outlet with a manager, and then with hourly wage workers, stocking the shelves, working the cash register. If the manager is doing more than 20% of that stocking and cash registry work, it may be that the exemption gets destroyed. There were a lot of class actions on this issue with assistant managers many years ago, because a lot of corporations or organizations were classifying their assistant managers as exempt employees, but it turned out it was a nice title. They in fact weren't managing the organization. They were doing the non-exempt type work. So giving non-exempt duties to an exempt employee can destroy the exemption. The other mistake that people make with regard to exemptions is to deduct wages from the exempt person's salary. Okay, there are a few limited reasons why you can do this, but for example, if you want to penalize somebody, an exempt employee, if you want to penalize them because they came in late, for example, you cannot deduct from their salary. They're entitled to their salary no matter what, because they are classified as exempt. Okay.
Okay.
Now.
All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about performance management. Tricia alluded to some of these items while she was talking about the wage and hour considerations. One of the major problems when you're dealing with performance management issues is the failure to document performance problems. There are many instances where a manager or a supervisor will speak to an employee about performance problems for production issues, but fail to track it in writing, which is a big mistake. It's important to cover all of these issues so that ultimately, if a decision needs to be made, there's documentary support for the decision that's being made. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't discipline or terminate an employee who has performance problems, but there's no documentation in writing, but it really makes your life a lot easier if at some point you need to be in a position to justify why you've decided to terminate, demote, or otherwise discipline an employee. Failing to document and failing to address coworker conflicts and other issues in the workplace, that's a form of ostrich mode management, where you're basically sticking your head in the sand. And that's something that, no one wants to be the bad guy, but there are times as a manager or as a leader where you actually have to take the initiative and be, and manage the employees to ensure that they're doing the right thing. Another problem is failure to treat similarly situated employees equally. Okay, we're talking about favoritism. Everyone has their favorites, right? But you can't show your employees who those favorites are. And while it's not always an issue of employment discrimination, even when it's not, it's something that could be easily misconstrued or easily construed as employment discrimination. So it's important to be equal. The biggest problem, biggest mistake in this performance management department is the failure to involve HR in employment decisions. Again, no one likes to be the bad guy. No one wants to be the one responsible for escalating an issue, but there are times when you absolutely have to. Okay, so let's talk about failure to document performance problems. It's important that when you document these problems, that you do them contemporaneously, meaning you can't decide one day, you know what, I've never documented Joe or Mary's performance issues in the past. I think it's time I start. Let me think back to what this person did a year ago, 6 months ago, and let me just start preparing memos to the file. Even if you're not looking to be deceptive, which obviously you're not, the fact that you haven't done it contemporaneously or at the same time that the disciplinary issue arose raises questions, or could raise potential questions, as to how legitimate the written documentation is regarding the discipline. And so for this reason, it's really, really important to involve HR early in the process. HR understands how to manage these issues. Your job is to get your employees to work, to perform properly, to get along. But in terms of managing it, it really is. If you start to see that there's an issue, you really need to get HR involved early on in the process. Again, one of the main reasons, or one of the important reasons, I should say, for documenting these issues is because they end up in the employee's personnel file. Okay, and in Connecticut, an employee Connecticut is one of those very few states where an employee has a right to see what's in their personnel file. Okay, and what Trish and I find is that subsequent to a termination, many times, a request will come from an employee or that employee's lawyer to have access to review the documents in the employee's personnel file. And so you want to have in those personnel files documentary evidence or documents that indicate that there was a disciplinary issue or there was a performance problem, so that you can later justify why you made the decision. And if that documentation's not there, it may be somewhat difficult to argue that the decision to terminate the employer, to take or to send them home or otherwise to disciplining them was not really serious. Okay, and under Connecticut law, an employee can submit comments to a performance review, which is a good practice, regardless of whether it's required by law.
And Sal, let me just chime in here and say, Sal and I are both trial lawyers, so we've tried many employment cases in our careers. And while you on the front lines may think, oh, it's a pain to document, oh, I don't want to bother. Let me tell you, the documentation, all of that documentation will become exhibits and evidence in our trial. We win cases on the basis of that documentation. We put up there, on this day, this happened, on this day, this happened, on this day. And, if you have a kind of policy of progressive discipline in your workplace, then all of those progressive disciplines showing the person had an opportunity to improve and did not, it's very helpful, because a jury wants to see the fairness, wants to see, okay, the person was warned. It's clear the person was warned, and then the person did not improve. The person was warned again, and the person did not improve. Really, juries are looking for fairness, and fairness means notice, and notice means documenting that you told the person, here's what they're doing wrong. They had an opportunity to improve and they failed to improve, and then they were suspended or terminated or whatever. So that's kind of bringing it full circle to where we end up coming into a case.
That's right. And one of the best things you could do is be absolutely familiar with the HR policies that relate to discipline. Okay, because Tricia mentioned something here that triggered something and made me remember a couple of issues that I've had in the past. And again, what dictates best practices is the kind of stuff that Tricia and I have seen problems with in actual litigation, right? So for example, so a lot of HR policies provide for progressive discipline, okay? If you stray from that policy, okay, you haven't broken the law, right? But you're gonna get asked, if it gets to litigation, you're gonna get asked, your policy says that these are the 4 steps that you're gonna follow in imposing discipline. Why didn't you follow them in this case? Okay, and I've seen it happen time and again. And sometimes it's not followed because not for any nefarious reason, or not because there actually is discrimination, but sometimes it's not followed because it's too cumbersome, or the supervisor thinks it's too cumbersome. It doesn't matter. If you don't have a good enough explanation for why it isn't followed, you're going to have a problem. And like Tricia says, juries like fairness. And that's why HR needs to be involved in the beginning, just to make sure all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. Here is a huge problem, okay? Ostrich mode management. By the way, I love this ostrich mode management thing. Tricia, you and I should have worn costumes for Halloween as ostriches, but
Speak for yourself, Sal.
That's true. Maybe it would have been better.
Like I said, I put on a suit jacket. That's my costume.
Sufficient. That's enough, right? That's enough. Failure to address coworker conflict, hostile work environment. Okay. Do not ignore comments and name calling when among employees, because it only gets worse over time. Okay. If it's obvious to other employees, and I'm going to tell you right now, it always is, the company is going to be deemed to know what is happening. And the problem with this area, okay, is that no one wants to make a big, and this is generally the attitude of managers, supervisors, and sometimes even the co-workers themselves, right? No one wants to, quote unquote, make a big deal out of something. They don't want to be perceived as the, as someone who can't take a joke. But the fact of the matter is that you need to put a stop to these things, because they always escalate, all right? And sometimes they result in, forget about harassment, hostile work environment claims. Sometimes they actually result in violence in the workplace, where there's destruction of property, where there's harm that's done to other people. So you really can't ignore these things. The company needs to take prompt action when there's conduct. And that doesn't mean someone needs to be fired. Okay, someone who never makes a joke in the workplace, slips up one time and makes a joke, it doesn't mean that person should be fired. And I'm not suggesting that they should be. In fact, Connecticut Human Rights and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission don't really like zero tolerance policies, because there are times when a zero tolerance policy prevents people from coming forward because they want conduct to stop. They don't necessarily want someone to get fired or punished. Okay, so it's important to make it clear that that this behavior won't be tolerated, but the response to whatever the behavior is going to be measured. Okay, it's going to be consistent. All right. A couple of more things on this issue when you're dealing with hostile work environment, and this is very important. If you are aware as a manager or supervisor that an employee is getting harassed, whether you're harassing the employee yourself, which you never would do, or whether the employee's other coworkers are harassing the employee, not only is the company going to be held responsible in a subsequent lawsuit if one is brought, but you as the individual supervisor or manager will be seen as having aided or abetted this type of conduct. Okay, you can be sued, and we see it all the time, and you don't have to be a bad person either to get sued. It's easy for this to happen. So get HR involved. HR will have policies on reporting these complaints, investigating these complaints, and resolving these complaints. Okay, and when you're dealing with these issues, and once you get HR involved, follow their direction in terms of how to keep these matters confidential. And I keep saying one of the one of the main things is, do not ever promise an employee who has an issue and comes to you for help, do not ever promise them confidentiality. Okay, that you will never, ever reveal that they came to you. It's impossible to actually follow through with that, because in order to conduct an investigation, you need to break some eggs sometimes, okay? And you're not going to be able to keep it absolutely secret. What you can assure employees is that you will keep it confidential to the extent necessary in conducting an effective investigation. All right, again, this is something that's up to HR to handle, but usually you're the first line of defense when someone comes to you to complain about a problem, or if you observe a problem yourselves. Failure to treat similarly situated employees equally, favoritism. Okay, so favoritism by itself is not against the law. But what we're talking about here is not how to break the law and get away with it. What we're talking about here is best practices to avoid misunderstandings and to avoid problems. Why is favoritism an issue? In discrimination lawsuits, usually they're defended and they're prosecuted based on how others who are similarly situated to the complaining employee are also treated. Okay, we refer to them as comparators. Okay, so for example, you have two people working in the same position. You have a man and a woman, all things being equal in terms of their qualifications, their performance, their duties, all things being equal, those people need to be treated the same. And if they're not treated the same, all right, and we're not just talking about material benefits like bonuses and things like that. We're talking about day-to-day terms and conditions. If they're not treated the same, you're going to have to explain why they're not treated the same. And you better have a justification, because plaintiffs' lawyers love this sort of thing. Okay, and I should know, because for many, many years I was a plaintiff's lawyer. Okay, so I know where I don't want to say I know where the bodies are buried. I know this is Halloween, but let's stay away from anything too disturbing. Let's stay away from these disturbing images. But I know where the problems are, and the problems generally are a failure to follow HR policies in disciplinary situations, and situations like this when you're dealing with favoritism. Is everyone in the same department? Is everyone performing the same job? Is everyone performing the same function being treated the same way? And if they're not, you need to ask yourselves why. Okay. All right. Failure to involve HR is the biggest problem. Trish and I could tell you how many times a week we get calls from HR people saying to us, yeah, we have this problem here brewing here, and well, all right, well, tell me about it. Okay, well, yeah, about 10 months ago. What are you talking about 10 months ago? Why didn't you call me 10 months ago? Well, we just found out about it yesterday. That's a problem, okay? Because so much could happen within that period of time that you get to the point of no return in being able to address a situation or to rectify a situation. If you see an issue, if you see a problem, involve HR immediately. Do not ignore it. These problems never go away, okay? And aside from best practices, you have a legal obligation to report harassment to HR. If you see something is bothering someone, you cannot be the arbiter of whether or not it's serious or not. Okay, you might have a thicker skin than the employee who's getting harassed or who's getting, who's the butt of someone's jokes. You might have a thicker skin and say, I'd be able to handle that. And that's good for you. Okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't rise to the level of harassment. So don't minimize these things. If it looks like someone is upset about it, okay, or not upset even, just slightly uncomfortable, you need to make a move and deal with it, okay? Because the company will have an obligation to investigate. Okay, leave accommodations. Okay, this is a big problem. Failure to offer FMLA. Again, you as a supervisor don't need to worry about the intricacies of the Family and Medical Leave Act, okay? But a lot of managers and supervisors, the mistakes they make is they take it upon themselves to determine whether an employee really needs time off, or whether or not an employee needs to report the time off a certain way to HR. Well, no, just take a vacation day, but you don't have to tell anyone it has anything to do with a serious health condition. That's not following procedure. It's important that when people take time off, HR knows what to designate it as, okay? Because under the FMLA, for example, people are entitled to 12 weeks, all right, or in some instances, 16 weeks of unpaid leave per year. So we want to count those days, all right, so that no one is getting an excessive amount of days off, where you have another employee under a different supervisor who's not able to get all those days off because that supervisor is designated the time off properly. So this goes to the issue of favoritism as well. Intermittent leave is a real challenge for managers, okay? That is a real challenge because intermittent leave, which is not taking time off in a block of time, like 2 weeks off, it's usually that sort of thing comes up when someone is going in for treatments, medical treatments, okay? Cancer treatments, for example. They might have to take off 1 day a week, okay, for that chemotherapy, and then maybe the following day when they're recovering from the chemotherapy or a partial day, okay, that potentially could be disruptive to a department, okay, but that's not your issue to worry about. This is an issue for HR. Get HR involved in something like this because a company is obligated to accommodate someone's medical condition and medical treatment and provide intermittent leave. Okay, so please keep that in mind. I can't emphasize that enough because I've seen so many cases based on that violation. Failure to address disability accommodation issues. This is very, very similar to what I just spoke about. And this is a big issue right now. Okay, with the vaccination mandates, you've probably heard a lot about religious exemptions, medical exemptions. What this really comes down to is requests for reasonable accommodation. And just to make this a little more relevant to what's happening now, this could be a situation where someone states that they can't get the COVID vaccine, based on a disability. Well, what's the disability? Well, when we say disability, we don't necessarily mean it has to be what we ourselves envision as a disability. It could be a medical condition. It could be an allergy to the medication. So the request in that instance is, I want to be exempt from the vaccine because I suffer from allergies. Okay. In that situation, the employer is required to engage in what we call an interactive dialogue, an interactive exchange with the employee, where the appropriate people, someone from HR and generally a manager or supervisor, get together and try to figure out, how do we accommodate this person? How do we exempt this person from the vaccine, but still promote why we're looking for people to get vaccinated in the first place, which is to protect coworkers. Okay, you need to get into that exchange, and the ultimate result might be, hey, we have a solution, you get to work from home. Or the ultimate solution might be, sorry, we can't do anything to accommodate you. Okay, these are not decisions for you as the supervisor or the manager to make alone. Okay, do not take it upon yourself to tell an employee, oh, really, you can't, you're objecting to getting vaccinated, or you need to get up and walk around because of back issues. It could be anything. This is not a manager's function to sort of decide whether or not these requests are legitimate. Okay, there are procedures that are followed. There are legal procedures that need to be followed. And this is why getting HR involved in this interactive process so early on is absolutely important. And do not discuss anyone's need for a reasonable accommodation based on a disability or based on religion, for that matter, with anyone else in the department. This is really a need to know sort of situation, but HR always needs to know. Interpersonal issues. All right, I see Tricia caught a picture of me recently when she visited the Stanford office.
That's you in costume for Halloween stuff.
Yeah, I wish I could say it was in costume, but that's an actual photo of how I go to work every day. Interpersonal issues, yelling, bullying, name calling, harassment, spatial boundaries, personal boundaries, too much information. Okay, I remember there was an SNL skit a few years back with Sherry O'Terry that used to kill me, where the employee where she'd come in and give everyone like too much information in the kitchen, all the employees, and I would laugh because it was exaggerated. But we all know those employees who tend to share a little too much information. Failing to attend anti-harassment training, not taking it seriously. We all look, everyone invariably, when they take, for example, this anti-harassment training, people think, oh, it's so obvious. Why are they asking us these stupid questions? Why do we have to check off these boxes? Everyone knows the answer. Well, you'd be surprised. Okay. You'd be surprised what people know and what they don't know. So these are things to take very, very seriously. And the management of interpersonal issues is very, very important. Again, get HR involved and don't share too much information.
And I'm just going to emphasize the protect yourself down there is that if you are a manager, supervisor, and you yourself are ever accused, as Sal said, of aiding and abetting or discriminating or harassing somebody yourself, it's actually protective of you to be able to say, I did attend this training on X date. I do know what the rules are in my company. I did not do this. And so it's kind of self-protective to say that you have engaged in a anti-harassment training.
Yeah, I want to mention something that I failed to mention earlier, but that I had said initially that I would make a big deal out of. When you're dealing with performance management, if you come up with a basis, or if you determine that an employee needs to be disciplined, okay, don't wait to discipline that employee. It's very, very important that you act promptly. Why? Because if you wait too long, okay, and I'm going to give you an example, and something happens in the interim, it could derail your efforts to discipline the employee. I'm going to give you a situation that I had, and I can't even say I had this as an employer side lawyer when I was a plaintiff's lawyer. This is probably about 20 years ago, where an employee called me saying that she was fired. She believed she had a case of pregnancy discrimination. Okay. Why did you believe you had a case of pregnancy discrimination? Well, my employer, who didn't know I was pregnant, kept criticizing my performance. And one day at 5 o'clock on a Friday, they called me into HR's office, and I knew it was coming based on my performance. And they said to me, so-and-so, we have something important to tell you. And I said to them, wait, I have something wonderful to tell you. I'm pregnant, okay? And so under some circumstances, some employers might have bristled and said, oh, okay, well, we just wanted to tell you, came in 10 minutes late this morning, but all's good, bye. This employer said, well, congratulations, but we're sorry to say you're still fired. And then this employee basically went out and found me. Okay, I refused to pursue it because it was dishonest. Okay, she had performance issues. It had absolutely nothing to do with her pregnancy. But Trish and I can tell you that there are plenty of lawyers who love cases like that. They love situations where something happens in the interim. Someone has a performance issue or a disciplinary problem. Something happens in the interim. Either they complain about something that they're entitled to protection from retaliation, or something else, or they need to take time off due to a medical condition or pregnancy, and then that sort of derails the process, and now you're stuck with this, or at least it seems that you're stuck with this employee for a long period of time. So act quickly, promptly. Once there's a performance issue, once you find that there's something that probably warrants adverse action to be taken, don't wait. Just get HR involved right away. And that's basically it. I hope we scared you.
Thanks, Sal and Tricia. So on that last topic that you were just talking about regarding accommodations and documenting things, one thing that's come up pretty frequently, I think, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about drugs and alcohol, but when you have a situation where there's an employee who is not performing well, or is coming in late, or is doing, something that's some sort of performance problem, and the manager does not document it, and then it ends up being that the person has an alcohol problem or a drug problem. When the employee then, let's say the employee ultimately calls the manager and says, okay, I'm in rehab. How does the employer know, all right, is it too late now for them to discipline the person? Because they've been thinking about disciplining the person all along, but now they're in rehab, so they're disabled. And so what does the manager do in that situation?
Diane, that's exactly this kind of situation that I was referring to before, because you can manage someone and discipline someone based on performance issues or behavioral issues in the workplace, regardless of whether they're attributable to drug or well, certainly not illegal drugs, but alcoholism or some sort of a disability. It becomes, the visual's not great, right? When you haven't documented it, the employee now says, I have to go to rehab, and you decide, well, we need to fire this person, not because of the rehab. No, it has nothing to do with that. It's because their alcoholism is not an excuse for these issues, but you never documented it, right? So what's the employee going to do in that situation? And that's why the documentation and why acting quickly or promptly is so important. what do you think, Tricia? I mean,
I also think it depends on your company policy and procedures and what your goal is, because there are companies that want to support somebody who voluntarily goes into rehab. Current alcohol or illegal drug use is not a disability covered under the ADA. However, seeking help, rehab could possibly be something that would be covered. And even if it's not, the question is, does your organization want to support this person's recovery and are they eligible for a leave of absence? Is this an FMLA covered leave of absence for rehab? Is this, under some kind of policy that you have where they're entitled to take this time off? And, or do you have other policies that say, look, we want to support people going into rehab, so therefore we're going to give them an unpaid leave of absence for this purpose? I mean, there are a lot of questions that are going to go directly to what your policies and procedures say. And this is why we say, get HR involved, because they should know these things and be able to tell you how they want to proceed. I mean, if it's the case that the person's a brand new employee, they don't have any available time, they haven't shown up to work, and you're not going to give them the time off, and they're going to be terminated but eligible for rehire if there's a position open when they return, that's another way to handle it. But these are all very fact specific questions based on your company's policies and procedures and how you're going to handle it in that situation.
Okay, great. And like I said, so the third segment today deals with drugs and alcohol, and so we'll be talking about that in a little more detail at that point. All right, so a question has come in regarding the exempt salaried employees, and you mentioned that, I think, Tricia, this was your area. Generally speaking, an employer cannot deduct money from a salaried employee's paycheck, exempt salaried employee's paycheck. And I believe there's one of the exceptions to that is if the employee takes a full day off and the employer has a policy for sick time. So the question is this: if you have an exempt employee who has exceeded the sick time allowance, so let's say the company has a policy that provides for paid sick time, you get 5 days, and this exempt employee is now on day 6, 7, and 8. Can the employer then not pay them for days 6, 7, and 8, or do they have to still pay them because they're exempt?
I have to check. There I think 5 or 6 specific allowed deductions from an exempt employee's paycheck. I believe taking sick days off after exhaustion of a company's policy is one of them. So if I'm right about that, I would want to double check.
Okay.
Then I would say that the way to handle that, I believe it has to be in writing and notifying the employee that, you've exhausted your sick time under our policy and procedure, and therefore pursuant to Connecticut General Statute, if you don't even want to cite it, just make sure. My advice there is check the regulations, double check to make sure that you're doing exactly by the letter what the regulations say you should do. And one of the questions I know I always have about that is, what does the state consider to be a policy, of sick leave? And I think it usually is just if you have 5 days off and then you exceed that, that can be a basis for not paying. But again, I'm not going to give that answer in this general way because it's very specific and related to the statutory reason. And so I would want to check all of the facts and the policy and the company's policy to make sure it complies and everything. But
Okay.
Generally, there are some limited exceptions, and that is generally one of them. But
Okay.
I'm not going to give a specific answer to a specific question like that.
Okay. And then we have Sal, do you have anything to add to that before I?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a very sticky area when someone actually exceeds the allotment, whether or not now you can dock them for days off. I've often, in practice, what I've told employers to do is to figure out a way not to dock. All right. You know, the general rule is if you're an exempt employee and you work one work day in a week, one day, you're entitled to be paid for the entire week if you decide to take time off. And usually that's managed through PTO or vacation time or sick time. But it is a sticky situation as far as I'm concerned, once you've exhausted all that time off and you start docking them. That's
Okay.
So here's what the regulations say. Deductions may be made for one or more full days if the employee is absent for personal reasons other than sickness or accident. That's one of them. FMLA, deductions may be made for one or more full days of sickness or disability, provided the deduction is made pursuant to a bona fide plan, policy, or practice of making deductions from an employee's salary after sickness or disability leave has been exhausted, which has been disclosed to the employee in accordance with section 3171F of the general statutes. That's what I'm talking about. It's extremely technical. And so we'd have to check, has it been exhausted? Has it been disclosed in accordance with section 3171F of the Connecticut general statutes? And do you actually have a bona fide policy, plan, or practice of making deductions? So those are the two things that would need to, that's what the regulation says. So that's what you would have to do in order to do this. But to Sal's point, whenever there's a deduction from an exempt employee's pay, the DOL is going to flag that if you get audited. So you have to make sure that you are absolutely technically correct on that.
Okay. So a related question to that is this, you may be able to see it. What if you have an employee that was given a position that the HR person made exempt, salaried, but really it should be non-exempt? How do you adjust that? Is there a way to adjust it?
Have to adjust it, right? It has to be taken care of, but from a practice, from a business standpoint, it's tricky, right? Because if the employee's been misclassified and hasn't been paid properly, and now you want to adjust it, that doesn't automatically erase the past violations, right? You still have that problem. And so you really need to look into it, determine whether the employee, the best you can, whether the employee worked overtime, make up for that overtime, right? And that's after you've shifted that employee over to non-exempt. But yes, it can be adjusted, and more importantly, it must be. It must be adjusted.
And you might have to go back 2 or 3 years if they've been in the position classified as exempt but working in a non-exempt capacity. If the DOL comes in and reclassifies that position, they'll go back 2 years in Connecticut, potentially 3 years under federal law. And those are the kinds of decisions that have to be made in conjunction with your management team and your attorneys as to whether you're going to go back and pay that person for all of the overtime that they might have worked in that period of time.
Okay.
Very, very, very tricky. And we do handle those reclassifications. They're very tricky.
Okay. All right, a question about the time clock records. You mentioned that a manager should never make corrections to a time clock entry without the employee signing off. So how does a manager handle it if the manager believes that the employee intentionally clocked in at the wrong time, too early or later than they actually did, and so won't sign off on the change?
Then you have a performance management problem. So if the manager changes that and the employee contests it, that employee is probably going to run to the Department of Labor, and then you're going to be hit with a claim by the Department of Labor for changing the records incorrectly. So you're going to have a conversation with that employee and say, I don't believe that you're recording your time correctly. And then you're going to have to be able to prove it. Why don't you think so? Are you standing there at their time clock? How do you know that they're not doing it correctly? And then, so if you have time clock fraud, that's a basis under most policies for terminating somebody, right? So, that to me is going to be managed on a performance management basis. And you need to have the proof as to why you're right and the employee is wrong, but don't change the time clock because that's going to get you into trouble with the department, or don't change the timesheets because that's going to get you into trouble with the Department of Labor. So have the conversation, note that you believe or have, what's the basis for your belief that they have been creating, that they've been fraudulently doing their timesheets, and then that's theft of company time, and you're going to have to manage them out of a position if they really are doing that, and you can't control it. So that's my advice there.
Okay. We had a question come in about when you mentioned, I think this was you, Sal, you were talking about how individual supervisors can be sued sometimes. Yeah. Do you happen to know, in your experience, are those supervisors covered by the company's insurance then? If they have EPLI insurance and the supervisor gets sued, can the supervisor rest assured, oh, well, I don't have to protect my house because I'm covered by the insurance?
Look, to some extent, I guess the answer is generally yes, right? But I think harassment situations are a little trickier. I mean, the answer is yes, all right? But I don't want to encourage that answer.
Sure, right.
All right, because it's not a license to harass, but it's problematic because, number one, ultimately, you're going to lose your job, right? Because you shouldn't be harassing people, if in fact that's what happened. But all right, yeah, the answer is generally yes. It is covered.
Yeah, and Sal, I'm going to say the first thing we do when we get a case like that where we have individuals is to determine whether or not there's going to be a conflict between the company and the individual. So frequently in these aiding and abetting situations, the supervisor really hasn't done anything. The supervisor might have just been like in the area and didn't hear it, and he's accused of having overheard something, etc. So my experience is for an aiding and abetting claim, the insurance is generally going to cover that. And because there's no conflict, everybody's on the same page, and the company's relying on the supervisor to be a witness in their behalf, saying no harassment or discrimination occurred. Okay. But there are situations where if the manager himself is accused of horrendous harassment, let's say ongoing, that's been unchecked, and then, particularly if there's more than one employee accusing him or her of that kind of egregious conduct, it may be a situation where the company says, we're not defending this guy, he's on here, or woman, they're on their own. So to Sal's point, generally, if you're conducting yourself in a professional manner in the course of your duties, then generally you're going to be protected by the company and the company's insurance. If you have done things outside the scope of your duty or engage in intentional harassing conduct, personally, you are not going to be covered. So it's really a question of, are you acting in the scope of your managerial capacities, within the scope of your duties, supporting the company, et cetera.
Okay. All right. So one thing that I mentioned at the start of the webinar was the fact that employers can sometimes be liable for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. So I'll throw this out as the last question. I'm sure you're familiar with the Tesla verdict that came out a few weeks ago. It was like $300 billion, not literally, but I think it was over $300 million verdict for a racial harassment suit, I believe. And I'm not going to ask you about anything specific about that case, but can you explain, a lot of people have asked, how could an individual employee be entitled to $300 million? Can you explain a little bit about what the difference is between punitive and compensatory and how that can happen?
Well, for openers, this was a California case. So California has all of its own laws and availability of damages that may not otherwise be available in Connecticut or under federal law. So I don't know how they ratcheted up to $137 million, but they're definitely, besides back wages, which is always an element, and front pay if the person can't get another job. Let's say somebody was terminated. I don't know the facts of the Tesla case, but if somebody was terminated or racially harassed and then terminated, they're going to get back pay, front pay. Then they're going to get compensatory damages, which are generally emotional distress damages. So if you have somebody, and under Connecticut state law, and maybe this is the same under California, I don't know, I'm not a California lawyer, there's no cap on compensatory damages / emotional distress damages. Now, in our state, we tend not to, give huge amounts of money for emotional distress damages. There are caps for those under federal law, but under California law, it's possible that if there's no cap and they have huge verdicts for emotional distress, the person was enduring this kind of stress for a long time, that could result in high damage award. And then, yes, punitive damages can definitely ratchet up damages, and punitive means willful. The company should have known about it. It let it go on. So that could easily ratchet up damages. Sal, I don't know.
Yeah. I think in this Tesla case, one of the issues was not so much what was happening to this individual employee who sued. I think they were able to show that it was an established pattern and practice that involved Tesla and these other staffing agencies that were providing workers to Tesla. And I think that's probably what explains the $137 million verdict. It was more of a punitive measure designed to deter or to encourage the company to clean up its act, or these companies rather, because it's not just Tesla, these companies to clean up their acts. Now, is it excessive? Maybe $137 million is or $150 million is excessive. But it certainly woke, it's a wake up call. Certainly a wake up call.
Yeah, I'm just 130 million of it was punitive damages. So that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I feel like Dr. Whenever I talk about numbers that high.
Just something to be aware of, I guess, that the employee, he or she is not only potentially going to get compensated for back pay, front pay, emotional distress, but if the jury feels that many millions of dollars is what it takes to punish a very wealthy company.
That's right.
Then that's what potentially is going to happen. I don't think we have a ton of Tesla's type companies in Connecticut, but it's just something to be aware of.
Right. Hey, look, 13 million is a lot too, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be 130 million.
Right. All right. Well, Sal and Tricia, thanks very much for all your expertise. I really appreciate it. Some of you can see that Meg and Vlad are on. They're going to be on next. But before we start with them, we're going to take a 15-minute break. So Sal and Tricia, I hope to see you again. And we will take a break and we'll be back at 9:30. Welcome back to CBIA's webinar on essential skills for managers and supervisors. We're ready to begin our second segment of the day, which will focus on strategies for managing a hybrid workforce. We're lucky to have two experts on this topic with us today, Meg Galastinos and Vlad Gogish, both of whom work for a company called Mercer, which is one of the largest global human resource consulting firms, serving over 29,000 clients and 170 offices around the world, including Hartford and Norwalk. Its mission is to help organizations develop healthier, more productive workforces and improve the financial wellness of their employees. So Meg is a partner and leader of Mercer's Connecticut offices based in Norwalk. She works with organizations of all sizes in the state to help deliver health, retirement, and talent management programs for their employees. She's been with Mercer for 12 years and previously managed their career business for the Northeast. And then Vlad is a partner in Mercer's Norwalk office, where he consults on high priority human capital issues like executive compensation, skills development, compensation plan designs, performance management, and talent effectiveness. He co-authored a recent article titled Getting Started with Skills and was a contributor to Mercer's Global Performance Management Study. Vlad joined Mercer in 2018 from IBM, where he held many different positions in both compensation and HR management. So Meg and Vlad, welcome, and I will throw it to you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Well, Vlad and I are extremely excited to be here today to speak with the CBI members on what is a very hot topic for our clients, and that is managing a hybrid workforce. And when we think about what we mean by a hybrid workforce, it's really that blend of employees who are remote with those who actually congregate in a central location, such as an office or a factory. And COVID has really accelerated the hybrid model. And through today's discussion, we are going to talk a little bit about why we think that hybrid is here to stay, and what employers could be thinking about to help manage this a little bit better. So for today's discussion, I am going to set the stage with some research that Mercer has recently conducted on behalf of employers and employees to really understand what some of the labor market challenges are, as well as what's on employees' minds. And then Vlad is going to be going through specific ideas and tips and a framework for managers and team leaders to think about as they're managing this complex hybrid workforce. And then we'll open it up to questions at the end. So thanks, and let's go ahead and dig in. So you have all seen the headlines about what's happening in the labor market in the US. We have an unprecedented number of job openings, 9.2 million that remain unfilled. And at the same time, what we're seeing is that the quit rate is at an all-time high, upwards of it's now about 3%. And unfortunately, we are not going to really see a lot of relief in terms of the supply of labor right now, because the work for the labor force participation is at historical lows. And we're not going to see the labor force participation grow much. It's projected to grow at only 0.3% a year. And this is really just driven by demographics of an aging workforce and the place we find ourselves in now. And Connecticut's results really wouldn't look much different than this. But what this means for employers in Connecticut is that competition for talent will really continue to loom large. The next slide. And so we've all heard about the Great Resignation, but is that fact or fiction? The reality is that when we survey employees, only 72% say that they do not plan to leave their current companies. And this is actually in line with historical norms. So at any given time, 14% are saying that they're seriously considering leaving your workforce, 14% are on the fence. And this is in line with what we've seen in, really over the course of several years. So, this headline isn't, too shocking, but this presents an opportunity for employers to, first of all, really address that 14% that's on the fence and see if you can re-engage them. And of the 72% that say that they're going to stay, really re-energize them. And we always tell our clients that it's not the risk of losing people and the attrition. The risk lies more in the people who are not energized and engaged in your company who decide to stay. So that's an opportunity, and we're going to talk a little bit about ways to do that. The next slide. So we asked employers over recent weeks to really look at the different categories of their workforces and help us understand across those segments, what percent are experiencing higher levels of attrition, that's the top line, as well as moderate to difficult in recruiting that segment of the workforce. And what clearly stands out here, you can see highlighted in pink, is that the pain point for employers is really in the hourly workforce segment, both the frontline and factory workers. And when you think about it, it's really not too surprising, since these employees have and really continue to bear the brunt of the pandemic. But it's also notable to see that nearly half of the employers say that they're experiencing attraction and retention challenges with mid-career professionals and specific retention challenges on entry-level professionals. And we've seen this more pronounced in industries such as professional services that rely heavily on knowledge workers. The next slide we wanted to do is really dig deeper into the different elements of what employees are saying by different demographics. And here you're going to see across the different categories of ethnicity, industry, income, and job level, that low wage, minority, frontline workers, and lower level employees are the ones who are more likely to be leaving at rates that are significantly higher than historical norms. So while that 72% that we talked about earlier, was kind of in line with the averages, we see huge disparities amongst these different job categories and demographics. We see this more pronounced in healthcare, in the food and retail industries. We see it more pronounced among Black and Asian colleagues, people who make less than $60,000 a year, and for hourly and entry-level professionals, as well as supervisors. And that's concerning for a lot of our clients too, because these are the frontline managers that they really rely to keep the lights on and to keep employees engaged. So that's something to look out for as well. So we wanted to really understand, well, what's keeping our employees up at night? Because this is a good way to better understand their unmet needs and what we can do about it. Employees' concerns over the Delta variant have really pushed the physical health and fitness to the top of employees' minds, really across all categories. This was also followed by workload balance and mental health, which is becoming a big issue for employers. Mental health was most pronounced among younger workers, women, low wage, and Black employees as well. And lastly, if we split out the data even further on the next slide, we can see the disparities between the low wage and the higher wage workers. So the data line here is amongst the dark blue is the low wage workers, the light blue is the higher wage workers, and amongst the lower wage workers, their top concern is covering monthly expenses, but mental, physical health, and also retirement are also very important to them. Higher wage workers are also worried about physical and mental health, but you see work-life balance and fulfillment and purpose are also their top concerns. So I think a key takeaway as we just kind of digest some of this data is, one, understand the environment that we're in from an external labor market perspective. That's not going to get any better for us, but it is important to really look at your own workforce in terms of not one particular body, but how we can segment that out and better understand employees' needs at different levels of their careers for different jobs, understand where you're having difficulty attracting and recruiting talent, and really understand what the needs of those employees are. So I'm going to hand it over to Vlad, who's going to provide a helpful framework for how to think about this.
Thank you, Meg. And as we go through, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask, or if you have comments, feel free to do that as well. So the next section is about actions that you as employers, as business leaders and managers can take. And we hear a lot about this phrase, the employee experience and total rewards. What does that mean? We think of total rewards as something concrete, something tangible, something that employees can actually feel every day that they show up, or as you talk to candidates, what is your company all about? That's what we think about as the employee experience. And we also think about how total rewards fits into that and helps create an environment that helps employees thrive. So on this slide, you'll see a pyramid. And foundationally, we need to be sure that as companies, we're providing a competitive wage and benefits offering. So without having a paycheck and feeling financially healthy and secure, it's difficult to feel fulfilled beyond your basic needs. So it's important to benchmark your compensation, especially in today's very competitive labor market. It's important to think about benefits and creative benefits that may, for the same amount of spend, actually yield better outcomes. So employees are craving that. They need to be paid fairly and competitively, and they want to feel rewarded, and they want to feel like the total rewards program helps them manage their health and their wealth in addition to just their weekly, biweekly paycheck. Once the compensation and benefits foundation is set, it's important to think about the middle section of the pyramid and the differentiated experiences that you can create to help people get more than just a job, but really feel like there's a career for them at your organization. So thinking about the longer term career journey, and that doesn't mean that everyone who comes in as a college hire becomes the CEO. We need to be honest and transparent with our people about what their career journey might look like. But having that visibility for them can help them feel engaged. And to Meg's point, those people who are with you are really important to keep engaged, because if they remain and they're disengaged, it can be worse than if a person leaves and creates space for somebody who's more engaged to come in. We'll talk a little bit about flexibility today. Certainly it's top of mind in this new world of hybrid work. And flexibility, the one thing I'll say here is it's not always about where the work is done. That's usually what people think about. It's more than that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then programs to help people feel well, physically, financially, emotionally, and certainly mentally. I know that there was a lot of discussion this month around mental health. So it's important too. One of the things we'll talk about later around mental health and hybrid work is that the boundaries between work and leisure are very blurred, and they may not exist at all. So in some professions that lend themselves to being able to work remotely, that especially in the height of the pandemic, anxiety about job security, again, going back to the foundations, if people felt like they weren't going to have a job or they weren't going to be able to pay their mortgage, it led people to work, even harder than perhaps they were working before. And one thing I would say is we see a lot in the news around increased productivity, but one thing we've also started to see in the news is that maybe people are calculating productivity wrong. Productivity is output per hour. So people may feel like they're being more productive because they're getting more work done, but they need to think about the denominator. If you're working more hours, you're not necessarily more productive. So just something for us as business professionals, as managers to think about. Yes, there is definitely a place for flexibility and working and balancing work life outside of the 9-to-5 traditional schedule, but you need to think about how much productivity is impacted by the amount of hours that are worked and what effect that has on mental health. So once we get beyond the compensation and benefits and the career and well-being, the thing that really creates staying power is what is your secret sauce as an organization? What helps your people feel aligned with their personal purpose, aligned with your organizational purpose? What makes them feel proud? If you ask them, if you were to get a job with the same pay and benefits, would you leave? Hopefully they will say no. Hopefully they'll say they would stay, because it's not about the pay and benefits. It's more about their connection with organizational purpose. So these are things to think about, and certainly the elements of the pyramid as far as what fits into each of these three categories may change, but we still feel like this is an important lever for the employer to think about retention and attraction. And flexible working is key. So nearly 60% of employees say that they will consider switching if flexibility is not an option. And enhanced flexibility is second only to pay and benefits in attracting workers to a new employer. Certainly, pay and benefits is important, but if we go back to this page, it's foundational. So no surprise that flexibility comes in second, but I'll also note that it's not just flexibility, it's also work-life balance. The pandemic has caused a lot of people to reevaluate their priorities. And you can see that in the comments that Meg made about the labor force participation rate. It's actually dropping. So people are dropping out, possibly for caregiving responsibilities, possibly for personal safety reasons. But that's why flexibility isn't just a nice thing to do. It's a necessary thing to do for a successful business. So how are organizations defining flexibility? We see best practices as far as starting with the work, understanding what the work, what the process is to complete, to take something, work on it, and deliver an output. So there has to be a fairly objective assessment of how flexibility impacts the productivity. Certain jobs just don't lend themselves to not being on site. Like if you're in a factory or in a healthcare setting, you have to be with the patients, right? So there are other dimensions of flexibility, but before you apply them, you have to assess the work and how it can be broken up potentially into different components, some of which may lend themselves to flex and some which may not. There's also the organizational context that's very important. So if you think about your culture, what your leaders expect, and what your employees prefer, there has to be a tailoring of flexibility that makes sense for your organization. And then we think about defining flexibility in terms of dimensions, personas, and boundaries. And I'll explain what personas mean in just a second. But if you want a very specific, tangible example of what I mean by personas, I would encourage you to go to the World at Work site. The World at Work is formerly known as the American Comp Association. It's kind of a professional association for total rewards professionals. But even if you're not in human resources, there's an interesting case study about IKEA and how they use the concept of personas in partnership with Mercer to develop a more tailored total rewards program. And it's all about thinking about what kinds of people work for you, not just the traditional analysis of looking at what job codes people are in or how old they are. And it's much more than that. And we'll give you an illustration in just a minute. But once you define the flexibility, it's all about enabling the change and thinking about the risk and compliance. Certainly, I think right before us, the speakers were talking about legal risk. So we're not a law firm, so we're not going to comment on specifics, but we'll just say that you need to have your policies well documented. If you're going to adopt a work from anywhere policy, be sure that you think through the tax implications of people moving to a different state where you may not have a tax entity. That's just one example. So you really need to think about the infrastructure and the supporting people programs. So as far as personas, we view the future of flexibility as extending beyond remote working. And it's really about being inclusive and thinking about all jobs being flexible. And as we said, it's about the dimensions. And it's really these 5 questions: where, when, how, what, and who. So the where is, for example, the engineer on this page. The person works a few days a week at the office, but otherwise works from home. And we'll talk in a minute about what types of work might be suited for that. When is around the timing. So for this person in operations, James works 40 hours a week, but he may vary the days and times. The how is the scaling and the technology. So an accountant might have 60 hours per week during busy seasons, but then scale back the rest of the year. So there may be some seasonality in the work that lends itself to varying the scale of the work. And then again, it goes back to the productivity. The what is the job content and sharing. So in this example, Shannon can share her caseload with another manager and work a reduced schedule to meet her personal needs. And then the who is thinking about the workforce model, potentially automation of work, but moving beyond the traditional employment model and considering, for example, freelancers or contractors or gig workers who could come in for a defined period of time to work on a project. So as far as what the hybrid model will look like for your organization, we have some leading practices and would encourage actually some questions or sharing, if you don't mind, around what this looks like for you. Because certainly businesses of different shapes and sizes are going to do different things as it relates to hybrid work. But if we think about it as far as the different roles of leaders and managers in an organization, we all have a role to play. So executives have to set the tone. They have to initiate candid conversations about returning to the office and they have to provide guidance. They have to think about what the protocols are around masking. For example, parts of Connecticut still have mask mandates, and they have to make it applicable to their teams. There has to be an excitement, a buzz around coming back to the office. If the executives don't set that tone, then people are going to feel like it's more of a compliance exercise, which is, I don't think anybody wants that to be the feeling. People want to feel like they're coming in to collaborate, use technology, maybe, go for happy hour if that's possible with colleagues. And they have to also establish a space for colleague feedback, because one thing we've learned around even technology like Slack, there was an article about how Slack has enabled frontline workers to provide feedback and reach very senior executives that they may not have had access to before. So we need to encourage that and collect feedback, and then think about addressing it to the extent that that realistically can, and amplifying best practices, because for larger businesses, there might be certain locations that have creative ideas that might work somewhere else. At the team or department level, it's important to think about team norms, and whether it's agreeing on what days people are going to be coming in, telling stories about success of specific practices of, hey, I was really able to do this workshop in small chunks. Instead of doing a 4-hour Zoom call, we used some collaborative technologies and broke it up into 3 smaller calls. Those sorts of things are important because we're all learning to an extent, and we have to adapt. I mean, I don't think ever before hybrid work has been such a norm, and creating challenges with even hybrid Zoom calls. I can imagine the time where this conversation, there will be people sitting in an auditorium, and then there will be others who are Zooming in. So we have to think about how to make those things work, and learn from each other. So that goes into the tools and the spaces that are available to collaborate, both digital and physical, and coming together in person and celebrating wins. And in a minute, we'll talk about when it might make sense to come together in person or to work digitally. And then as far as managers and colleagues, they should discuss their work preferences and establish a plan that works. So we mentioned a minute ago, there's definitely a toll on everybody's mental health, given the pace of work, this premium on efficiency. Like, you get on a Zoom call, there's very little small talk, you get straight to the point. So there needs to be some ability for people to connect as human beings. And part of that is how managers and colleagues need to factor that into their flex work plans. So nobody wants to come into an office and sit on Zoom calls all day, right? We might as well do that from home. So as far as confirming work status, whether somebody is going to remain a telecommuter, or if there's an expectation that certain days of the week people are in together, the point of being together is to connect and collaborate. And managers are also, it's really important for managers to keep a pulse on the sentiment and well-being, and again, to help honor work-life boundaries, and remind colleagues that they're accountable for setting those boundaries. Because with this flexibility, there's an expectation that the colleagues will manage their time effectively, meaning that it's not always about working longer, it's about setting certain boundaries and being more productive. And then we have some tips here for facilitating or running meetings. So it's important when you're meeting as a group, like this, I would say this meeting is a best practice. You have clear agendas, you have objectives, we have rules for engaging with each other and with the speakers. There's somebody on point for the technology. So that's a great way to run a meeting, and would, I think, encourage you all to apply that if you don't already. Sometimes the technology can be the biggest barrier to a successful meeting. When meeting as a team, it's good to test and reinforce new ways of working. If you're running a meeting with people who don't work together all the time, you might consider an icebreaker or something less formal to start the conversation. And then it's important to also learn, so that as a meeting concludes, certainly track your action items. But if you found something that worked really well, make sure that your colleagues are learning about it. And then when managers and colleagues meet one-on-one, it's better to ask open-ended questions than yes/no questions. Like, I wouldn't ask the question, "Are you happy?" Because that doesn't really give you an insight. So ask questions like, what is working well? What feels like a blocker? An excellent question that I recently started asking my direct reports is, if you were managing yourself, what would you do differently than what I'm doing? And they were like, oh, it's a really good question. So, I mean, you have to be ready, because I don't know what your people are going to tell you if you ask them that question, but that's the only way you can get honest discussion going, and get people to surface those concerns around blockers or personal fulfillment. As far as building flexible ways of working, it's good to, similar to how we were talking about flexibility and breaking the work down into different dimensions. These are some of those dimensions that you could consider. There are, for example, expectations and outcomes. Different work requires a different cadence, a different timeline, different quality standards, right? Like if you are in a certain industry that requires very specific quality and on-site support, those outcomes need to be clearly defined. If the work is client-facing, your clients or customers might have a preference. Again, some companies may not have that choice. Certain industries, you have to be on site. But there might be in professional services, for example, there might be some flexibility with how clients prefer to collaborate. For larger employers, it's important to think about where the team is located, and to think about if it's more efficient to maybe engage someone from another office or another location if that person has the expertise. And then if there are certain days that people prefer to be together in person, those should be part of the desired interactions. And then these are some bullets at the bottom as far as what types of interactions might lead to different decisions about where the work is done. So as far as rules of engagement, there are certain commitments that are good to make to each other. So for example, I have a client that has no video Fridays. So that's kind of like a commitment that they've made to each other internally and to us as their consultants. They ask us to not do video. You know, we read about Zoom fatigue, et cetera. So that's one part of it. Another best practice I've seen is using the features of Zoom or Teams to, raise hands. That kind of helps with meeting flow, especially in larger meetings, like in front of a board committee where there might be some different opinions. That helps manage the conversation flow. And it's really important to define the rules of engagement for the hybrid meetings where you've got some people sitting in a conference room. They might be having sidebars, and the people on the phone may not be able to participate and they might feel left out. It's also important to think about the actual setting of the conference room and the technology, right? Because it might lead, if you don't have the right technology, you might have audio issues with multiple laptops, people dialed in, or people huddling around one laptop to fit into the Zoom frame. So we're all learning, but it's important to address those issues head on. Otherwise, those foundational things may derail your meetings. And then as far as performance enablement, it should be incorporated into the performance management process, because one challenge for managers is not being able to observe the work when it's done off-site. So it's important to set goals and to the extent possible, measure the results, not the activity. Even before COVID, when we were advising our clients, we would always talk about that it's important to measure what is actually done. The how is important as well. But it's important to not focus on, oh, wow, I saw, Joe online really late last night, or, Sally leaves the office at 5 o'clock every day to go pick up her kid. And I'm intentionally using those genders because of the pattern, like I heard the words pattern and practice. So there's obviously a historical stereotype around that. So don't assume that just because somebody is online at a certain hour that they're working really hard. Measure them on the work that gets done and how well it's done and how they interact with their colleagues and clients. So these are some ideas around actually building flexible ways of working. And then one last slide around heads down versus heads together. I really like this spectrum because it's a good way to think about how to break down the work. If it's heads down, independent flex time or focus time, it's a good time to really focus on something, reflect, hear yourself think, literally hear yourself think, because I know for open offices, sometimes it gets so loud that you literally can't hear yourself think. And the hope is that once you get that task done, you feel accomplished and recharged. There might be a middle ground where it might be a hybrid meeting where some people are on Zoom or together in person, or maybe sometimes you do it on Zoom and sometimes you do it all in person, but feelings of being supported and aligned result from being able to come together, learn and develop, especially today when so many, we hear about the Great Resignation, and as we saw from Meg's comments, quits are at a record high. Well, those people are quitting and they're going to other jobs, which means it's crucial to onboard them successfully and make sure that they learn and develop. So there is a middle ground there. There's definitely some that you can do remotely, but some is just better to do in person. And so for that, the heads together, it's more around getting in a room and doing a workshop, networking, and celebrating. That's important too. We've all been through a very difficult period that's not over. As Meg said, now we're just moving on to different challenges. And so any opportunities we can have to come together, recognize high performance, reinforce the as we saw in the pyramid, the mission of the company, the purpose, that is something that is very effective to do in person. Can work on Zoom, but things that are better in person are what we have here on the right. So we've covered a lot. I'm excited that the number of participants has stayed steady. That's terrific. We'd love to hear your questions or reactions. And Meg, I also wonder if you want to add or amend anything that I said.
Yeah, I think this was great, Vlad. I think that very practical ideas for people to, to hopefully take back to their organizations, but we're happy to entertain any questions.
Okay, I've got some questions for you guys. Either one of you can take these. So you've mentioned the Great Resignation. So with respect to Connecticut specifically, we are hearing a lot of comments from employers who are having a lot of trouble finding employees and keeping employees. And Vlad, you mentioned that, when employees are leaving, they're going to another company. I'm hearing that that's maybe not necessarily true though. So when you think about Connecticut, what is your opinion? Like you said that the compensation is just the bottom and you have to consider the middle and the top as well. But in your mind, what are the best ways that employers can stop this resignation and get people to come back on? Is it really just having creative benefits, or what do you think?
I agree, Diane. Not everyone is going to another company. They're sometimes just dropping out of the labor force, which we covered as well. I don't think anyone really has the answer. I mean, we're seeing inflation that we haven't seen in many years. So certainly that means that it's not just creative benefits, it's also higher comp expectations because people are facing higher cost of living. I think though, it can be challenging to only compete on the price of labor, which is basically salaries and wages and benefits. That's why we do think it's important for companies to talk about their unique value proposition. What makes it a good place to work? If it makes it a good place to work for current colleagues, then it should, in theory, be a good place to work for new recruits. So there's something to be said for putting your employee value proposition out there and refining it if you have to. But yeah, for sure, no one is going to show up because you have a great culture, but you pay, you know, nobody pays below minimum wage, but you know what I'm saying? Like you have to pay a competitive wage. So that we mentioned the importance of benchmarking and making sure that you're, you know, because certain clients of ours haven't benchmarked jobs, they haven't updated their salary ranges, and so it with the way the wage inflation is going and the cost of living is increasing, it's not appropriate to just take something that was done 3 or 5 years ago and use that to set your pay. The market is just moving too quickly.
I would just, add to that is, use this as an opportunity to like look at yourself as an employer from the outside, right? Like, if you Googled your company, what would come up? Would it be an attractive place for people to work? Do you get a sense of what working at the organization looks like from your website? And, I think also we found, specifically for entry level employees, those that were onboarded during the pandemic are most likely to leave because they didn't and were not able to really establish that affinity to the organization. So while the pay and benefits were great, there was really no one around to build their network, learn new skills, and they just didn't feel connected to these organizations. So that was really the population that was most at risk, was those who have been also onboarded during this.
All right, so can you think of any specific examples? Let's say we're talking about a manufacturer and they mostly are having trouble attracting hourly workers, not minimum wage, but let's say like $20, $25 an hour type hourly worker. And you say, you want these workers to know that it's going to be a good place to work, hourly wage aside. Are there any specific pieces of advice that you can give on how employers can either advertise this or make it clear to people that they're trying to attract that this is something that the employer does, that this is a good place to work?
I would say reach people where they are, right? So if you're looking for hourly people, they're probably not sitting in front of a computer. So make sure you're using social channels like Facebook. They may or may not be on LinkedIn. So you need to do research to figure out where these folks are spending their time. Then you have to use digital advertising to get to them. And then the bar is high. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's easy. Amazon is paying that for operational roles. Other large employers, I mean, you have like Costco and Walmart literally chartering their own ships because of the supply problems that they're having. So,
right.
And they're the kinds of companies that have the money to pay for like things like tuition reimbursement. But it's not all about money. It's also around, so I work with Connecticut employers. It's also about the culture. It's about, in some cases, family ownership and not working for a large publicly traded company that has the pressure of quarterly earnings. There's a different culture at some of these smaller companies where they might actually know the senior executives. So it's important to advertise that and help people feel like they're maybe starting out at 20 to 25 an hour, but the company is going to potentially give them additional skills, which they may or may not apply at the company. I mean, if that the company has to think about the career model. like what is going to cause someone to do a difficult job for, you know, like $40,000 or $50,000 a year, beyond the money. And there has to be some thought given to the career progression and examples. Like if there are real examples of people who started out in the proverbial mailroom and worked their way up, it may not be applicable to most people, but the stories are powerful. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
And yeah, those are great examples, but and I would also add, you know, from our research, we found that employees who just believe that their employer cares about their physical and mental well-being are like 10 times more likely to stay. So it's so important, no matter what benefits you're offering, honestly communicate those to employees and let them know about the availability, because, you know, oftentimes they really don't understand everything that there is to take advantage of. So especially, you know, given the data that we're seeing now, this is such an important concern. If employers are paying for healthcare, communicate it, help them access it, and make sure that they know the value of the benefits that you're providing.
So Meg, can you give us a sense of, do you have some examples maybe from your clients of wellness programs that offer unusual or creative, maybe not too expensive for the employer, but something that's some sort of creative benefit that employees find useful and may encourage them to come on board?
Sure. And, you know, we've really seen some really kind of clever ideas in, you know, throughout the pandemic of employers who, you know, really want to make sure that folks are kind of tapping in and leading healthier lifestyles. So I would say in general, clients really want to be able to kind of measure the ROI on these investments because they're not necessarily inexpensive, right? Some of them are add-ons. And so, you know, rather than just offering everybody maybe, you know, a couple $100 for gym memberships, which they may or may not take advantage of, and we don't really know the return on that, you know, look at your population and really understand, you know, what are some of the specific health issues that you're dealing with. So in some parts of Connecticut, you know, asthma is actually a really, you know, big issue. Smoking cessation, if you have a large population that, you know, is smoking and you see high incidence of lung cancer. Diabetes management is another one. And there's also, you know, some opportunities to, you know, partner with some specialty units in terms of, you know, joint hip replacement and cardiac services as well. So I think what employers can do is, you know, really target what's most specific to your organization and meet those needs. And that's way they're going to have a much better outcome in terms of, you know, the costs for the employer, but also the wellness of employees. And then I would also just say, you know, there's some fun, easy things to do. That, you know, some step challenges, some movement, like Mercer's in the middle of one right now across the country where we're competing with different offices on, you know, movement and step challenges. And so give people the license to say, you know what, you know, we're going to have this, and each team that competes, if they win, they're going to get $1,000 towards a local charity. That's really motivating for people, and it's a fun way to maybe get together for, you know, walks and do fun things as a team.
So then
I would like to tell you that we are number one.
I was just going to say
Connecticut's number one. Yes.
So yes, just telling you we're walking the talk. And the way to do that is to have a colleague badgering people, like, you know, nudging, like that's what you got to do, because otherwise people just are too busy. So that doesn't cost anything.
I'm not the nudger.
No, that's Janine. But I'm just saying it creates a fun sense of competition, and it doesn't really cost anything.
Yeah. So have either of you actually come across any client who has successfully addressed the childcare problem? Anybody who's come up with some way, I don't know what it would be, but have you heard anything about how to address that?
I mean, Amazon is, it comes down to money. In the surveys that we do, employers it's not a prevalent practice because it costs money.
Yeah.
So Amazon is helping with parental leave and onboarding practices for people who take time off. But there's no way around it because there's no government provided childcare unless you're talking about K through 12.
Yeah, so I guess one possibility would be, to the extent possible, we wouldn't be talking about manufacturing here, but to allow people to work really unusual hours, I suppose. And Vlad, as you were saying, as long as they get the results done, it doesn't really matter if they do it at 11 p.m. That would at least to some extent address that childcare issue.
Sure.
But I'm wondering on that issue, you mentioned, for supervisors to pay attention to the result. But I think a little earlier in your talk, you were talking about, you're not actually being productive if it takes you twice as long to get that result. So do you have any recommendations on, let's say you're a supervisor and it's time for you to evaluate someone's performance. With this new hybrid environment, should the manager be discounting the amount of time it takes to get that result, or is that still something they should be paying attention to? Assuming, I guess, that the person is salaried, that would be one issue, wouldn't it? Because you don't want to pay them twice as many hours to get the same result. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, I think it's going to vary, and I think if the company has a relative performance evaluation system, that needs to be applied consistently and fairly. So if it took one person twice as long, but a peer in the same job could do it for half the time, then I would say the manager should take that into consideration. But of course, there could be extenuating circumstances. And it's not black and white. My only point was that I think generally speaking, and there could be exceptions, some people really may feel like they're more productive at home. But I think there's this perception that working from home is always good. And I think that that's not always the case because it does blur the line. People are always accessible, so you always feel like you're on. And I think the point we were conveying is that it's important for managers and employees to have honest conversations about being on at certain times, because human beings are not programmed to be working 24/7.
Right.
I think also in this hybrid model, and we touched upon technology a little bit, but it does also suggest that we need, workstations that are state of the art, both at home and in the office, right? And so that's difficult because, some people have better setups than other folks at home. And we need to kind of unpack a little bit about well, maybe why is that employee not as productive in a remote environment? And we need to really understand, do they need, different tools or, things to better, address some of the challenges of working from home, because it's not easy for everybody.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that would probably come up. I was thinking about, performance evaluations and what issues come up in those evaluations for hybrid workers as opposed to full-time in the office workers. And I guess, like Vlad, you were saying you want open-ended questions, and you combine that with what you were just saying, Meg, if you're trying to figure out why someone isn't working well from home, that actually may be something that is solvable. Right? You just kind of have to really try and figure out, well, what exactly is going on? Why aren't you productive? Can we do something to make you more productive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we get feedback as, we talk to our colleagues who are more junior about the importance of technology, especially now when people, like to Meg's point, are starting remotely and they're not getting the coaching or in-person feedback that they would in an office environment. It's really important to be very clear and tech enabled. And actually, in some ways, this is more of my opinion, but I think it kind of turns the conventional wisdom that you shouldn't micromanage on its head. So I read an interesting article, I think it was in the New Yorker, about the cult of personal productivity and getting things done, 7 habits of highly effective people, et cetera. And there's this assumption that, and I'm talking about salaried workers now in the article, that was the focus, there's this assumption that white collar workers, you just tell them what you want, you tell them the objective, and they have to figure out how to do it. Well, in an office environment, it's a lot easier to go, like, I can go to Meg and ask her, how do I do X, Y, Z? There's really, like, we're not taught, our school system isn't set up to actually teach us how to do the work that we're asked to do when we actually show up. So I think it's very challenging. As a fellow manager, I empathize with all of you on the phone. It's very challenging because you don't want to come across as a people manager, but on the other hand, if you tell somebody who has no idea how to do something what you need to get done, you have to give them the tools to do it.
Right. Okay, Meg, in closing, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think I would just add that this continues to be a very fluid situation, right? And especially for Connecticut, as people look to go back into the office maybe 2 to 3 days a week. We're going to be learning from those experiences. And, right now, some of our towns have mask mandates and social distancing. That creates challenges amongst itself to keep people, safe, distance, but masked, which is uncomfortable for employees, right? And we expect that some of those guidelines will be lifted in the coming weeks, in which case we'll have to, again, probably, redo our floor plans and come up with some new protocols. So I think the flexibility and agility of employers is just really key in this environment. And I think, Connecticut has proven that it's pretty resilient, and, that's going to be just an important thing going forward. So I would just say be patient. This will evolve, and we're going to learn from this even more.
Yeah, that's a great comment to end on, I think, because I maybe last year everyone thought, okay, we're going to come back in X number of months, and people thought they had like a definite plan. Oh, that's the day we're definitely going to come back. And then, well, maybe not, maybe 3 months after that, and then maybe 3 months after that. So now I think we all have this sense that we're going to be flexible. We'll take it by week or month by month, and just, be willing to change as the needs arise.
Exactly.
All right, well, Vlad and Meg, thanks so much for your information and your expertise. We are going to take a break, and we'll be back at 10:45. And at that point, we'll have our third and final segment, and we'll be talking about drugs and alcohol and how to be a manager who may be dealing with employees who have those issues. So we'll take a break, and we'll see you at 10:45.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, let's get started with our third and final topic on essential managerial skills. This topic will focus on improving a supervisor's ability to recognize and respond to employees who are potentially living with addiction. Our two speakers on this topic are from an organization called the Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery, or CCAR. CCAR provides peer-based recovery support services to people with alcohol or other drug addictions. It strives to remove the stigma that surrounds addiction and recovery through advocacy, education, service, and by putting a face on recovery. So we do have two faces to present today. The first is Rebecca Allen, who works as the organization's Director of Recovery Advocacy. She grew up in Eastern Connecticut and has worked in the behavioral health field for over 20 years. She received her undergraduate degree from Eastern and a master's in public health from UConn. As part of CCAR's leadership team, she directs the advocacy efforts of CCAR and the larger recovery community. She identifies herself as a person in long-term recovery and has been drug-free for over 23 years. Rebecca's drug of use was heroin, and so for her, the ongoing opioid epidemic conversations are very personal. She offers herself as living proof that recovery is possible and advocates for policies that make it easier for people to initiate or maintain their recovery. And with Rebecca, we'll have Regina Magera, who's a recovery coach program coordinator at CCAR. She is a dual diagnosed person with 17 years of recovery from a substance use disorder. In her life, she has struggled with both mental illness and addiction, which drives her to use her own life experience to help others overcome similar encounters. Regina is a certified facilitator. She's been doing this with a diverse group of nonprofit organizations since 2014. She began volunteering at the CCAR Hartford office in 2016 and became an emergency department recovery coach in 2018. So this segment is going to focus less on the legal implications of employees with addiction and more on managerial soft skills like transparency, communication, empathy, listening, encouragement, etc. Rebecca and Regina are not attorneys, but if you have specific questions about legal issues on this topic, like how to handle leaves of absence or disabilities, things like that, I'm happy to join in at the end with the Q&A and see if I can give some assistance in that way. So having said that, Rebecca and Regina, we're ready for you to start, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Diane, and good morning, everybody. I will share my screen. Okay. Let's get this started. Okay, excellent. I hope everybody can see my screen. Regina, can you just nod your head since I can see you? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Rebecca Allen, and I am a person in long-term recovery. And for me, that means it's been over 23 years since the last time I used heroin. I share this openly with the hope that by doing so, it could help others that are struggling, with this issue come forward and get help and treatment. I worked for an organization called CCAR, the Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery, and I am their Director of Recovery Advocacy. So when Diane called me and, our organization uses CBIA. So we do a lot of, we call them to ask questions about specific issues around HR and things like that. But Diane had contacted me and asked if I would be willing to do this presentation. And I said, absolutely. I think that, employees that are struggling with these issues really need support and help, because these, it can happen to anybody. So what are substance use disorders? So substance use disorders, it's an umbrella term for people that are struggling with alcohol or drug use, or misuse, I should say. And when I say drugs, I do mean street drugs, such as heroin, cocaine, as well as prescription drugs that you may get from a doctor. These both alcohol and drugs can affect your neurotransmitters, so serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and they have addiction is both a physical and a psychological component to it. And some of the physical component could be withdrawal, it could be cravings, tolerance, so building higher tolerance, needing more of a substance to have the same effect, and the lack of control. And I'm going to go over this graph because this is a really good way to, this is what a doctor would use to assess somebody if they have a substance use disorder. And you can see that, somebody could have a mild, moderate, or severe case of a substance use disorder. So there are, different levels of and this really is important when it comes to seeking treatment. If somebody has a mild substance use disorder, they may be okay to attend maybe an outpatient treatment, have a one-on-one with a counselor and things like that. Somebody with a severe substance use disorder may actually have to go to an inpatient treatment facility or to, you know, maybe have some type of medication that helps them. So, you know, these are some of the things that medical professionals will look at when they're assessing somebody with a substance use disorder. I want to say too very clearly that a substance use disorder is a medical condition. It is not a moral failing or, you know, a lack of willpower. What happens is when people start using substances, it actually changes the way the brain functions. So it makes it harder for them to not do it. It makes it harder for them to, you know, it makes you have cravings. You can have some physical, you know, things that happen to you when you stop using a substance. So this is really a medical condition, not a moral failing. So, you know, one of the things is using more or using the substance longer than intended. Persistent desire for it or unsuccessful effort to cut back, like I just shared. Your brain doesn't function the way it used to, so making those decisions can be harder. Spending a lot of time to obtain the substance or to use it or recover from it. So this is common with alcohol where, you know, when you're younger, you may be able to drink and wake up and not have a hangover. But as you get older, you know, or if you start using more of it, you may wake up with a hangover. Craving or desiring it strongly. Recurring use causes failure to fulfill major obligations at work, school, or home. So this is really, you know, to the workplace, you may have an employee that is missing a lot of time, or they're not able to, you know, get projects in on time, things like that. Use continues despite persistent or recurring social or interpersonal problems. Giving up social, occupational, or recreational activities due to use. Recurring use in situations in which it's physically hazardous. Use continues despite knowing it causes physical or psychological problems, developing tolerance or needing more of that substance, and experiencing withdrawal symptoms or using the substance to avoid withdrawal symptoms. And what are some of the signs? So I also want to say too, and this came as a surprise to me, that alcohol is an addictive substance. So when somebody has been drinking and they drink every day, when they stop drinking, they have some physical withdrawal symptoms that happen that can be pretty dangerous. So if somebody is severely addicted to alcohol, they need to be in a medical facility when they start withdrawing from alcohol. They can go into seizures and it could be life-threatening. But what are some of the signs of a substance use disorder that you may witness at a workplace? So dilated pupils. So that means that the black part of somebody's eyes is very, very big or very, very little. Both of those can be symptoms of drug use. Sedation or nodding off could be a sign. Agitation or inability to sit still. Jaundice, yellowing of the eyes and skin. And that is usually due to alcohol, but it could be something else as well. The odor of alcohol. Somebody's speech could be slurred, their hands shaking, especially in the morning. Like I said, alcohol has a physical withdrawal component. And sometimes when you are, you know, first thing in the morning, if you haven't drank, your hands may shake. But really focusing on behavior. And this doesn't mean that all of this behavior may be due to an alcohol or a substance use disorder, but it could be. So if you notice that an employee is tardy or calls out a lot, especially on Fridays and Mondays, if they're argumentative or short-tempered, and these are behaviors that you haven't seen before in an employee. They start to isolate or keep to themselves. And again, focus on the performance piece. Their performance has really decreased. I want to bring this up around words and how they can really play a part in somebody's motivation to seek help. And Don Koyas is a Native American leader. And he said that words are important. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. And if you want to kill something, you call it a weed. So one of the things that as an advocate, I really try to pay attention to is language and how I'm speaking about people that are experiencing a substance use disorder. And many people may not want to seek help or even say that this might be going on with them because of the stigma that's attached to it. And like I said, it's not because they're bad people or immoral or that they're out of control. But they don't want to be seen as one of those people. And hopefully this video works. And Regina, if you can hear it, kind of just raise your hand, okay? Can you hear that, Regina?
No.
Oh. All right, I'm going to skip over that video for now. I'm sorry, Molly, did you have something?
Rebecca, I was just going to say it's probably you having to connect your Zoom audio into the feed, so we can maybe do that later, okay?
Okay, that sounds good. That sounds good. All right, excellent. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is talking about person-first language and what that looks like and how you could apply to it with a person that has a substance use disorder or discussing a person with an addiction. So person-first language focuses on the person and not the disorder. So for example, addiction is a moral issue, right? That's bad. Addiction is a disease. And what's even better to say is addiction is a health condition. Instead of saying substance abuse, try using substance use disorder or addiction. Instead of calling people an addict or a junkie, again, person first, the person is addicted or the person is living with an addiction. Relapse is part of recovery for some people, right? But relapse is really part of the disease. And even better, relapse is not a requirement. There's many people that seek help and get treatment and don't have another issue around alcohol or drugs. Another thing, calling somebody a client, a consumer, or a patient, try saying a person is in recovery or a recovery is the language that we use at CCAR. Again, the client is non-compliant, the treatment is not working, or there are multiple methods to initiate recovery. Medication is a crutch. Medication is one tool of recovery, or there are multiple pathways of recovery. So depending on what substance a person may be using, medication can be very helpful, especially if somebody is using opioids. So opioids is a class of drugs that is very physically addicting. And, when people stop using, they have some really, really uncomfortable physical withdrawal symptoms. And there are medications that can help people by them not having these withdrawal symptoms. And I'm going to apologize in advance. There's a ambulance going by my building right now. It's kind of loud. But there's a medication that can help people, and it can stabilize them so they can work on other areas, whether it's working one-on-one with a counselor, or whether they're involved in some type of a support group or things like that. And again, self-help, a recovery fellowship, or a mutual aid are different ways to talk about that. And again, more recovery-friendly language. So not calling somebody a junkie or an alcoholic, saying that they are a person with an addiction. Again, substance abuse. We are trying to move away from that as a field, and hopefully as a society, and talk more around, a substance use disorder. So when you say substance abuse, it sounds like, that person is to blame for their situation, that they're abusing, and it just has a really negative context to it. So again, a person with a substance use disorder. Clean or dirty, that's usually, something that they talk about when somebody is in treatment. But again, it does have a negative context to it. And you can just simply say, instead of clean or dirty, you could say positive or negative. And detox. So, again, maybe we can talk about in remission or in recovery treatment. So these are all words that can have a negative effect and a negative impact when it comes to somebody seeking help. So I'm going to turn this over to Regina, and she's going to talk a little bit about recovery coaching. But Regina, if you could just tell me when to advance the slide for you. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good morning. Let's talk a little bit about recovery coaching. Recovery coaching is a set of communication tools that can support and encourage an individual to improve their health and wellness one step at a time. Recovery coaching also supports individuals who want to reduce or stop their substance misuse. Below, you will see the CCAR Recovery Coaching Fundamentals on our three-legged stool. They are treating people as resources, which is the top of the stool and one of our main fundamentals, followed by the three legs of the stool: listening actively, discovering and managing your stuff, and asking good questions. Recovery coaching empowers and encourages individuals to follow through and believe that people can improve. Next. Okay, let's talk a little bit about asking good questions. It is important that you ask employees good questions. The questions should be open-ended, which will invite the employee to tell their story in their own words. Some suggestions may be plainly, how are you? What can I do to help you improve your performance? How can I support you? Is there anything you would like to talk about? Focus on the employee's performance and tangibles. Suggestions: I see your performance is falling behind. I've noticed that you have been late 3 times this week. And lastly, tell me about or talk to me about missing so many days of work. Next. Okay, let's talk about active listening. While speaking with an employee, it is imperative that you actively listen to what the employee is trying to communicate to you. A few suggestions for actively listening are focus. Focus on the employee and avoid distractions that may take your focus away from the employee. Remain non-judgmental. actively respond to questions that the employees may have for you. Try to put yourself in the employee's shoes. Use all your senses and pay attention to your body language. Lastly, reflection, which consists of repeating, I hear you saying, paraphrasing, am I understanding you when you said, and lastly, summarizing what you heard to ensure that there is a clear understanding between you both. Next. Talk a little bit about managing bias and judgment, which is discovering and managing your stuff on the stool. When you're speaking with an employee, you will need to manage your bias and your judgments that you may have. Some suggestions: identify any biases that you may have and just set them aside. Use recovery-friendly language as previously discussed. Don't take things personal when you hear them. Pay close attention to your body language and keep an open mind. Next. Okay. Treating people, treating your employee as a resource. By treating the employee as a resource, you will be allowing the employee to feel respected, self-directed, and that they are being heard. A few suggestions. Let the employee decide what may work best for them. Empower the employee by showing that you value them and they are important. Support their efforts to be their own best advocate. You can refer to human resources and also refer to EAP, the Employee Assistant Program. And finally, let the employee know that they are not alone. Next.
Okay, so I'm going to jump back in here. We're going to go through maybe a common scenario, and Regina is going to, talk about some suggestions on how to talk to an employee that, that may be in this situation. I do want to say this is that sometimes a substance use disorder may, it may not be a substance use disorder. Maybe somebody is struggling with their mental health, but either way, having a conversation that is based on empathy and respect and the desire to help is that's going to hopefully get you the result. From what I remember talking to Diane is that most people that reach out to her around these issues are not looking to fire people. They're really looking to help their employee. So again, coming from a place of, empathy and wanting to truly help somebody goes a long way. So a common scenario could be that an employee has been with your company for many years and they've had no previous performance issues. But in the last 6 months, you've noticed the following. So they're calling out sick frequently on Fridays or Mondays. They're constantly late. Their productivity has dropped. There's numerous projects that are late and their work seems rushed. Their coworkers have been complaining that they have a bad attitude and that they're argumentative. And on a couple of occasions, you've smelled the odor of alcohol in the morning. So what are some ways you could have a conversation with this person? So Regina, you had some suggestions, so go ahead.
Well, a few suggestion questions may be, for instance, I see that your productivity has dropped a lot. What can I do to help you improve your productivity? What do you need from me? Another example would be, I notice that you have been constantly late. How can I support you in improving your attendance? And lastly, I've been aware of your projects being late and rushed. Do you need support to help you complete them in a timely manner? Or what can I provide to you that will help? And a general question that you can open up the conversation would be, would you like to discuss any issues that you may be having? Next.
I do want to add this, that I think that it's okay to say to your employee, you know, hey, I have smelled alcohol a couple of times. You know, are you struggling with your drinking? I think it's okay to ask that. And, you know, sometimes, you know, you might get, you know, that person might be upset, and you can back off and say, you know, this was just my observation. I'm not accusing you of anything. However, if you were struggling, I want you to know that you know, there's support and that there's treatment, and you can talk to, you know, HR or something like that. But sometimes asking a direct question, as long as it's, you know, as long as you're asking in a respectful and like I said, empathetic way, it could really open the door for somebody to ask for help. Another common scenario could be that an employee has been with your company for about a year. They have no previous performance issues, but in the last 2 to 3 months, you've noticed the following. That again, that they're calling out sick frequently on Fridays or Mondays, that they're late returning from their breaks or from their lunch, that they look disheveled, you know, their clothes seem, you know, wrinkly, you know, they look like they may not have brushed their hair, you know, things like that. They've been caught napping at their desk. They seem tired a lot. And you've heard that they've borrowed money from some of their coworkers. So what are some of the ways that you can address this? So Regina?
A few suggestion questions that I have. I saw you napping at your desk. Are you okay? How are you feeling? Another question that I would ask, or I would say, is, it has come to my attention that you have been late returning from lunch. Is there a way I can assist you with managing your time? How can I help you balance this issue? Another way is, I noticed that you are frequently calling out sick on Mondays and Fridays. Can I be of some support regarding this situation? Would you like assistance in adjusting your time? And my final thing would be, I am concerned with your job performance. How can I help you be more productive in your position? Is there anything you need from me to assist you to increase your performance? Those are just a few examples that I can come up with. Rebecca?
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, again, this situation could not be somebody that you know, is struggling with a substance use disorder. It could be something else. But opening up the conversation, asking them some open-ended questions, and just, you know, as a manager, we have a, you know, we have a role that, you know, we need to make sure that people are doing what they need to do. So, you know, this wouldn't be, you know, you still have to hold people accountable. But asking some good questions and, you know, letting them know that you care about them as well as the work. So here are some tips. Regina, do you want to go through these?
Oh, sure. A few best practices to consider and tips. Keep the tone of your voice low and slow. Have a genuine desire to help and support. If the employee denies having a problem, admit that you were mistaken, but have a genuine concern. Leave the conversation on a high note of trust and openness, and continue the discussion at regular intervals until the concerns are all addressed.
Excellent. Thank you for this. So at CCAR, you know, we have 51 employees, and you know, having lived experience with a substance use disorder, you know, is a lot of what we do. So we do what we term as peer services. So as a director and as a manager, you know, I know that some of our staff members are people in recovery and people that have lived experience with substance use disorders. And I've been with CCAR for about 8 years. So it has come up where maybe a staff member, there's a concern that they may have returned to use. We treat it like any other health condition. You know, we have a conversation with them. Many times, if it is true that that's happened, they want to get help, you know, so, you know, they're referred to our HR, and, you know, we do have an employee assistance program, which is wonderful. And I highly recommend that you have that. It's a great benefit to staff. You know, but they are referred to HR, and it kind of goes from there. We do have short-term disability. So if somebody does have to go into a treatment, you know, they're able to do that. You know, but there's also some flexibility as well. So knowing that a lot of our staff members are in recovery, we can be flexible when it comes to, you know, say they want to attend a meeting during their lunch hour, but instead of 12 o'clock, it's at 1 o'clock. As long as it's not affecting, you know, their job, that's okay for them to flex their time. You know, say that we know somebody is on a medication that that may make them tired or whatever. As long as it's not interfering with their job duties, you know, we keep that in mind. We know, especially with the pandemic too, that many people are struggling, and many people will continue to struggle. So just, you know, being kind, being empathetic, being willing to work with staff that may be experiencing a issue around alcohol or drugs is just really important. And you know, at CCAR, we truly believe that our human resources are what makes us as an organization. So our staff understand that they're the most important, you know, part of this organization. So Molly, I'm not sure if you're able to get the video going or not.
So my suggestion would be to see it. It's more of like an offline thing. I would have to like walk you through how to connect the
Okay,
audio. I'm sorry.
that's
You might be
fine.
able to- Molly, is it an option to, when the attendees get the recording and the slide deck via email, is there a way to forward that link so they can click on it and watch I think it's a video of Regina, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that'd be an option?
So similarly to how the resources are listed in here, I would just suggest maybe putting in that hyperlink so the attendees could just type it in themselves or copy and paste it.
Okay, yeah, so in the slide deck that I sent yesterday, the hyperlink is in there. So if the attendees want to, you know, after this is over, click on the link and watch that video, I highly suggest it. And also there's other videos too that you may find interesting. We did a whole series of storytelling videos, and these are stories of people that have lived experience with substance use disorders. And I can say that they're very artfully done. You know, when I share that I am somebody with, you know, somebody in recovery, I get a lot of looks because apparently I don't look like I used to do drugs. But again, you know, this can happen to anybody. It's, you know, I don't know when you cross a line with, you know, drinking socially or, you know, having an issue with drinking, but it happens to a lot of people, and the same with substance use. With the opioid epidemic, many people became addicted after being prescribed opiates by their doctor. So this is, you know, this is a growing issue, and especially in the workplace. And because of that, the Connecticut Department of Labor has this whole initiative called the Recovery Friendly Workplace Initiative. I do have a link on the slide. So if anybody's interested in becoming a recovery friendly workplace, you know, please go onto that link and kind of go through the materials. They have a toolbox and all sorts of different resources and information for employers that are looking to do that.
Rebecca, do you
again,
want me to really quickly see if I can play the video on my end?
Yeah, could you do that?
Yep, no problem. Let me just see if I can share my screen and you guys can just let me know if it works, okay?
Okay.
Regina, while Molly is doing that, do you know if you click on that Labor Department link, will you also find the link to that toolkit that you sent me earlier? I thought that was really helpful. The employer
I believe so,
toolkit.
Diane.
Okay.
I believe so. Yep.
So if everyone kind of keeps an eye out for that, there's a link, here comes Regina, to an employer toolkit that's really helpful. Let's see if we can get this to play. Go ahead, Molly.
Just let me know if you guys just shake your head if you can hear it, okay?
No.
All right. That was my best guess.
Okay, so we'll just have people do that on their own when they get the slides. So I just want to, as we're kind of bringing this to a close, this segment, I do want to just touch on a couple of issues. Rebecca, I'm so glad that you mentioned that sometimes it is okay just to say, you know, you kind of smell like alcohol, and I'm wondering if there's a problem that I should know about. That is legal. And so I was curious to know if that also was advisable from your point of view. And so that's good to hear that you feel like that's okay, that that's not going to cause any big problems, that an employer can, and everyone should understand that we're kind of talking about two different issues. What Regina and Rebecca have been focusing on, as we said, are kind of like the soft skills on how you can communicate with your employees who may be going through this, with the goal that you're not going to just lose this employee forever. You're actually going to help them and they'll come back or stay and be able to be an effective employee. So those are some of the skills that we've been talking about. And then separate from that, legally speaking, I think the most important thing an employer or a manager can do is to just know what your policy is, figure out what it's going to be. So you as a company theoretically, you could have a very strict policy that just says no substance abuse under any circumstances. And if you have that policy, you can actually terminate someone for substance abuse, even if they're on FMLA leave, because you can take, if you're an employee with substance abuse and your substance abuse qualifies for FMLA leave, which it won't always, but in some cases it will, you can go out on FMLA leave, but the reason for your termination may be something, maybe the substance abuse. It could also be any other legal reason like theft or poor performance. But the point is that in order to do that, you need to have a very clear policy that that's the way you're going to handle substance abuse. I think Rebecca and Regina would hope that that's not the way that you were, that's not what your policy was going to be. And so another alternative to consider if you're in the managerial role is to think about what are the types of things that we can accommodate. So if I'm about to approach someone who I think may be suffering from addiction and may benefit from inpatient treatment, for example, before you go up to them and ask them these open-ended questions, you have to think, what's my response going to be when they say, you know what, I actually am suffering and I actually think I would benefit from treatment. What's your policy going to be now? And so legally speaking, you don't violate the Americans with Disabilities Act by uniformly enforcing rules. Like you can have a rule prohibiting drug use, but in some cases, addiction is a disability, particularly recovering, which is what we're talking about today. Recovering from addiction can often be considered a disability. And so that would mean that as an employer, you may have a responsibility to accommodate that disability. And there's various ways of doing that. You can provide unpaid leave. You could provide different schedules. Like Rebecca was saying, someone might need to go to an AA meeting at a time of day when they would normally be working. You could accommodate that. And so it's important to just meet with the powers that be. It may be you guys who are listening, but someone at your company should think about and create a policy, figure out what you can accommodate, what you can handle, how you'd like to react, and whether you can actually offer assistance to your employees with the goal of having them come back and be effective employees. So just kind of generally speaking, the two laws to keep in mind are the ADA, three really, I suppose. There's the ADA, that's federal law that protects disabilities. And then there's Connecticut's version of the ADA, which is a Fair Employment Practices Act that protects people with disabilities. And then there's the FMLA, which in some cases will protect people with substance abuse disorders. Those are the kind of things to keep in mind. So now, having said that, Regina or Rebecca, do you have anything in particular? Is there anything else that you want to add before we close out?
I just want to thank you, Diane, for inviting us to do this presentation and just to encourage everybody to, to understand that, CCAR defines the recovery community as individuals in recovery, their family, friends, and allies. And I think in order to kind of change the conversation that substance use disorders are a medical condition, not a moral failing, or not because people are bad people, that it takes all of us. So thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
So that'll bring this segment to a close. And so thank you, Rebecca and Regina, for your help. That was very enlightening and very helpful. And I'm glad you guys could join us. So thank you to all of our speakers today. These are all really important issues for managers to think about and to understand. Thanks to all of you for attending and for submitting questions. For those of you who are CBIA members, if you have follow-up questions that you didn't want to ask through the Q&A function. You can call the CBIA hotline, or you can submit a question online and we'll get to those. Also, as we mentioned, the slide deck and a recording of this webinar will be sent out to all the attendees within a day or two. So that'll bring the webinar to a close. I hope everybody has a great rest of the week, and I hope we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.